Urgent! Lukashenko has betrayed Putin and switched sides to China. While the Kremlin shouts about an unlimited partnership, Xi Jinping seems to already be redrawing the political map around Russia. The most painful blow came from where Moscow was used to seeing unconditional loyalty. Meanwhile, chaos is erupting in the occupied territories, explosions, fires, blackouts, and problems that can no longer be hidden behind propaganda. And in the Kremlin, they are already starting to look at the calendar with anxiety. They are counting down the hellish 40 days. And as if that weren't enough, a story is surfacing that reveals Putin's true moral state. Valdai is being demolished out of fear. What is really happening, and why has the Russian system suddenly started to fall apart at the seams? Let's talk about this right now. Hello, this is Ukraine Today. I'm Maria Farafonova, and here are the latest events. It seems the Kremlin hasn't noticed how Russia has started to lose its superpower status. While Russian propaganda talks about an unlimited partnership with China, in Beijing, the roles have long since been assigned. Russia sells cheap oil, gas, and raw materials, while China buys up these resources at a discount, captures markets, and increasingly ties Moscow to its own economy. The former geopolitical giant is rapidly turning into a junior partner, becoming more and more dependent on Xi Jinping's decisions. The biggest problem for the Kremlin is that after the start of the Great War, Russia trapped itself. Western markets have been lost, sanctions are pressing, and there is no real alternative to China anymore. Now Moscow increasingly agrees even to unfavorable terms just to avoid losing Beijing's support. And while Putin dreams of a multipolar world, the center of power in Eurasia is already shifting from Moscow to Beijing. China is not fighting for Russia, is in no hurry to save it, and does not recognize the seized territories. Instead, it calmly profits from Russia's problems, strengthens its influence in Central Asia, and is increasingly active even in regions that Moscow has considered its own sphere of control for decades. In fact, Xi Jinping is doing what sanctions and diplomatic pressure have failed to achieve. Without firing a single shot, China is gradually depriving Russia of its status as a major global power. And while the Kremlin used to try to dictate the rules to its neighbors, today it is increasingly forced to adapt to the rules set in Beijing. But even this is not the end. China is increasingly drawing into its orbit even those whom the Kremlin has considered its own sphere of political control for years. And the loudest signal came from where Moscow least expected it. Lukashenko, who for decades was called Putin's closest ally, after a difficult conversation in the Kremlin, suddenly went to seek support from Xi Jinping. For the Russian elite, this feels almost like a personal insult. After all, when even the most loyal partner starts looking toward Beijing, a very uncomfortable question arises. If China is already taking Moscow's closest allies, then who will be next? And what exactly happened behind closed doors, after which Lukashenko essentially left Putin alone with his problems? More on this coming up. He ditched Putin and went to negotiate with China. What happened during the talks between the old friends? Putin and Lukashenko spent 2 days behind closed doors, but after the meeting, something very strange happened. There were no traditional hugs in front of the cameras, no joint statements about brotherly nations, not even the usual parade of stage photos that for years were meant to show the world the unbreakable friendship between Moscow and Minsk. Instead, there was almost complete silence, and for authoritarian regimes, silence after negotiations often says much more than dozens of official communiques. The thing is, right now, Putin doesn't need compliments or diplomatic courtesies from Lukashenko. The Kremlin needs Belarus as a military resource, as territory, as a staging ground, as yet another tool to continue the war. After Russia lost a huge amount of equipment, personnel, and time, Moscow is increasingly returning to the old idea of using the Belarusian direction for renewed pressure on Ukraine, while simultaneously keeping NATO's eastern flank on edge. But it seems that this time Lukashenko did not want to be the person who would personally open the door to a new major escalation. According to analysts, the issue of using Belarusian territory may have been the main topic of the negotiations. And judging by the outcome, Minsk's response turned out to be extremely unpleasant for the Kremlin. It is especially interesting that this whole story is unfolding just a few days after another very telling episode. Lukashenko essentially confirmed that he had turned off the relays that the Russian side was using to coordinate drone attacks. Moreover, he openly stated that Belarus should not be drawn into the war. For a person who for years had demonstrated almost unconditional loyalty to the Kremlin, such statements are more than eloquent. And then things got even more interesting. Hardly had the difficult talks with Putin ended when Lukashenko almost immediately found himself in Beijing. Such a swift arrangement of a meeting with Xi Jinping has already been called a separate signal by many experts. When, after a difficult conversation in the Kremlin, a person immediately flies to the Chinese leader, it looks like an attempt to find a very influential interlocutor and at the same time a very serious safety net. In Beijing, Lukashenko heard exactly what he wanted to hear. China officially declared its support for the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of Belarus. For diplomats, this is a standard formula. For the Kremlin, this is very unpleasant news, as China has essentially drawn a line. Belarus must remain a separate state, not turn into yet another military testing ground for the implementation of someone else's plans. And here, Putin has found himself in a rather awkward situation. Just a few years ago, Moscow could almost unilaterally dictate the rules of the game to Minsk. Today, however, Lukashenko has gained a powerful external resource for maneuvering. While the Kremlin demands greater involvement in the war, China reminds them about stability, trade, transit corridors, and economic interests. And lately, money and logistics sound much more convincing to Minsk than yet another military adventure. Beijing has a very simple reason not to allow Belarus to be drawn into a new round of war. For decades, China has been building transport routes to Europe, investing in the Belarusian economy, and viewing Minsk as an important hub for its presence on the continent. Any opening of a new front would mean the risk of closed borders, new sanctions, and the destruction of part of these plans. And for the sake of the Kremlin's fantasies about another march on Kyiv, the Chinese leadership clearly does not intend to sacrifice its own interests. Another aspect is no less painful for Moscow. Lukashenko has long since learned how to survive among bigger players. For years he balanced between the West and Russia. Now he is increasingly adding China to this equation. In fact, the Belarusian leader is demonstrating that even under current conditions he is capable of saying no to the Kremlin and not ending up alone. For Putin, this is a very unpleasant signal, especially now when Russia is desperately trying to show the world that it has a strong camp of allies around it. But when your closest partner, after talking with the Kremlin, flies not to coordinate joint actions but to seek support in Beijing, very uncomfortable questions arise about the true strength of this alliance. It is not without reason that political scientists call Lukashenko a political weather vane. He rarely takes risks unless absolutely necessary. He almost never takes the side that, in his opinion, might lose. If Lukashenko is now increasingly showing caution regarding the Kremlin's plans, this may indicate something very important. Even among Russia's closest circle, fewer and fewer people are willing to tie their future to Putin's policies. And this story may go far beyond the Belarusian issue. If China is indeed beginning to take a more active role in the processes surrounding the war, if Beijing is increasingly openly demonstrating its own red lines and the Kremlin's allies are more and more often seeking support there, then Moscow is gradually losing its monopoly on influence even in those countries it considered its own rear just yesterday. And while Russian propaganda continues to talk about the unity of its allies, reality itself is presenting completely different scenarios. One dictator spends 2 days in the Kremlin, refuses the most important requests, and then flies to Xi Jinping for political cover. For Moscow, this looks like a very troubling sign that even its closest partners are paying more and more attention to a future without Putin. The night was restless for the occupied territories. Explosions were heard in several regions at once, from Melitopol to Crimea, and within a few hours, reports began to come in about fires, damaged substations, and large-scale power outages. Parts of the occupied areas of Kherson region, Donetsk, and a significant portion of Crimea were left without electricity. Even the occupation officials appointed by Russia confirmed this. In Crimea, one crisis is piling on top of another. Just a few days ago, the occupation authorities imposed restrictions on electricity consumption due to network overloads. And now, after a new wave of strikes, there are once again reports of outages, explosions, and fires. When the system is operating at its limit, even a single precise strike triggers a domino effect. In Melitopol, after the nighttime explosions, eyewitnesses reported a large fire, and in the Starobyshev area, information emerged about a possible strike near the building of the occupation administration. Russian public channels traditionally tried to downplay the scale of the event, but this time it turned out to be much more difficult to hide the widespread power outages in several occupied regions at once. For the Kremlin, the most unpleasant thing is not even the blackout itself. The worst part is that the problems are starting to become systemic. First, strikes on oil depots, then on logistics, followed by attacks on bridges, substations, and energy infrastructure. The Russian system is increasingly forced to patch up one hole, while new ones are already appearing elsewhere. And each such night makes the occupied territories increasingly expensive and difficult to hold. Overall, we are seeing a picture emerge that is unlikely to let anyone in the Kremlin sleep well. While fires are being extinguished in the occupied territories and people are being told why the electricity has suddenly decided to take a vacation, in Moscow, they are already nervously flipping through the calendar. The first days of the 40-day campaign announced by Zelensky are bringing explosions, transportation problems, infrastructure accidents, and ever new surprises for the Russian war machine. So a rather uncomfortable question arises for the Kremlin. What will happen on the 10th, 20th, or 40th day? After all, while Putin talks about stability, the shockwave is already rolling from the occupied territories to the very heart of Russia's defense industry. And the first signals of this countdown for Moscow have turned out to be more than painful. The details are in our report. The countdown has begun. Putin has been given 40 days. After Volodymyr Zelensky's statement about a special operation to influence Russia, the Kremlin could hardly have expected such an explosive start. Because while Russian propaganda once again talks about reliable protection and complete control over the situation, explosions were thundering in Volgograd at one of the most important enterprises of the Russian military-industrial complex. And this was not just a warehouse with canned goods or an abandoned base on the outskirts. The Titan Barricades plant, a true pride of the Russian defense industry, came under attack. It was here that components were produced for the Iskander, Yars, Topol-M missile systems, and even for the much-publicized Oreshnik promoted by the Kremlin. In other words, we are talking about an enterprise that directly serves the Russian missile program. The most interesting thing is that the facility is located about 400 kilometers from the Ukrainian border. This creates a rather awkward situation for the Russian leadership. On the one hand, Putin assures the population that all threats are supposedly under control. On the other hand, Ukrainian strikes are now reaching facilities that, until recently, Moscow considered to be deep in the rear. According to available information, the strike hit 3 production workshops. One of them has sustained serious damage. It was there that the mechanical assembly unit was located, where key components for Russian missile systems were assembled. Thus, one of the sections was damaged, without which the entire production chain begins to operate much more slowly. The situation looks especially amusing against the backdrop of constant Kremlin statements that sanctions are not working and that Russia's defense industry is only gaining momentum. It turned out that imported high-tech equipment was actively used in the production of Russian weapons. But now the problem is not even the origin of the machines. The problem is that the workshop where they were located will have to be restored after a very unpleasant encounter with Ukrainian strike weapons. And here arises the main question: if this is only the beginning of that very 40-day campaign, what will happen next? After all, the Kremlin is already forced to patch holes on several fronts at once. Somewhere oil depots are burning, elsewhere airports are shutting down because of drones, and in other places there are problems with logistics and fuel. And now even strategic defense enterprises are starting to appear in emergency incident reports. The Russian system is gradually shifting into a mode of continuous response to new crises. Not planning, not development, not preparing new offensives, but rather constantly putting out fires, both literally and figuratively. And every new strike adds yet another problem for Moscow that needs to be urgently resolved. For the Kremlin, this is especially painful because such strikes destroy the main myth of Russian propaganda, the myth of absolute rear area security. Because when explosions occur hundreds of kilometers from the border, when enterprises involved in the missile program come under attack, and strategic factories are forced to halt operations, it is becoming increasingly difficult to talk about stability. So while Moscow counts the percentage of successfully intercepted targets, it seems a completely different countdown has begun on the Ukrainian calendar, and each day of this campaign may bring new surprises for the Kremlin. And most importantly, it serves as a reminder to the Russian leadership of a simple fact: the longer the war drags on, the closer its consequences come to the very heart of Russia's military machine. And it seems that the problems of the Russian defense industry now begin not only from the skies, but also within their own factories. While the Kremlin boasts about record-breaking drone production rates, events may have taken place in Alabuga itself, the main assembly center for Russian Shaheds, that are unlikely to leave Moscow pleased. According to the resistance movement, Ukrainian agents have been carrying out sabotage operations over the past month directly at the facility where strike drones for the Russian army are assembled. And it's not about loud explosions or fires. A much more dangerous scenario for the occupiers could be when problems begin after the drone has already left the factory gates. It is reported that dozens of surprises have been planted in the new batches of drones, which can disable the equipment during use. For the Russian military, this is essentially the worst possible scenario. After all, it's one thing when a drone fails to take off at the testing range, and quite another when a malfunction occurs during combat use, when it is assigned a specific mission and a certain outcome is expected. For years, the Kremlin has been assuring the public that Alabuga has become a true war conveyor belt capable of churning out drones by the thousands. But now a very unpleasant question arises. If saboteurs really manage to infiltrate one of the most important elements of the Russian war machine, then just how reliable is this entire conveyor belt? Then that's not all. According to the underground resistance, information was also obtained about the personnel involved in the production of drones for the Russian army. And this means that the problems may go far beyond just a few defective products. After all, when the enemy gains information about production chains and key personnel, the entire system comes under threat. While the Russian authorities are preparing to repel attacks from drones, missiles, and naval drones, problems may arise where they are least expected, right inside their own factories. And if previously Moscow feared strikes on defense enterprises, now they also have to think about what is happening behind their fences. Very difficult times are coming for the Russian war machine. Some factories suffer from attacks, others from logistical problems. And now there are reports that even Finnish products can bring unpleasant surprises to their own customers. And if this information is confirmed, it will be one of the most painful signals for the Kremlin. Problems are beginning to accumulate not only at the front, but also in the very heart of the Russian military-industrial complex. Kiev was never taken in 3 days, but they did have to demolish their own residence. A story has surfaced in Russia that perfectly illustrates how much the mood in the Kremlin offices has changed over the years of the Great War. OSINT analysts have reported that one of Putin's residences has disappeared in Valdai. And now many people are asking a simple question. If the master of the Kremlin is so confident in his own security, then why remove an entire facility that for years was considered one of his most secure hideouts? Just a few years ago, Russian propaganda was selling the public the image of an all-powerful leader who controlled the situation from the Baltic Sea to the Pacific Ocean. Today, however, that same leader increasingly resembles a man who is constantly looking over his shoulder. The Kremlin continues to talk about victories, but behind the high fences, people are increasingly thinking not about offensives, but about their own safety. This is especially evident after a series of Ukrainian strikes deep inside Russian territory. Explosions at airfields, fires at strategic enterprises, and drone attacks on targets that until recently were considered unreachable are gradually destroying the main myth of Putin's system, the myth of absolute control. Because when even the closest circle starts building additional layers of protection, it is no longer a sign of strength but of anxiety. And while Russian television continues to paint a picture of stability, reality is becoming less and less comfortable for the Kremlin itself. Once they dreamed of holding victory parades on Kreshchatik. Now more and more attention is being paid to securing their own mansions, travel routes, and places of leisure. The war they plan to keep far from Russia has gradually reached its very heart. Moscow is increasingly beginning to resemble a city that the war has finally reached. Drones regularly break through to the capital, strategic sites are burning, and Muscovites search for shelter in the middle of the night and wake up to explosions. And the most interesting thing is that at the very same time, the Kremlin continues to assure the country that everything is under control. But the more strikes that occur in Russia, the louder the air defense works over residential neighborhoods, and the more frequent new crises become, the harder it is to hide the obvious. Reality is breaking ever more painfully into the world that Putin has spent years building for Russians out of television illusions. Details in the report. Moscow can no longer pretend that the war is somewhere far away. What for years was shown to Russians on television as someone else's misfortune has suddenly started knocking on the windows of the country's most expensive neighborhoods. The capital, which was used to living with the confidence that it was protected by the most advanced air defense systems and an endless military budget, has faced a very unpleasant reality. Drones keep coming again and again, and residents are waking up more and more often not to alarm clocks, but to explosions and rumbling in the sky. What especially worries Muscovites is that at the critical moment there is silence. The sirens are silent and no warnings are issued. People only find out about the danger when they hear the distinctive sound of engines over their homes or when anti-aircraft systems start firing in the sky. And this is where the main question arises. If the capital of the world's largest country is under attack, why hasn't the government explained even the most basic safety rules to its citizens? It turned out that Moscow, which for decades was presented as the center of a mighty superpower, is completely unprepared for life under an aerial threat. People are searching for shelter maps on their own, exchanging addresses in chats and forums, calling officials and trying to figure out where to run in case of another attack. But instead of clear answers, they often encounter a bureaucratic labyrinth. In some districts, information is concealed, while in others, people are advised to come to the administrations in person. It gives the impression that finding a safe place in the capital is much harder than finding yet another propaganda story about complete control over the situation. Meanwhile, the very sky over Moscow is increasingly becoming a source of fear. The Russian air defense system, which for years was showcased at parades as a symbol of invincibility, is now forced to operate directly over residential neighborhoods. Debris falls to the ground, explosions ring out near houses, and residents watch all of this from their balconies and courtyards. This is especially striking against the backdrop of years of Kremlin statements about the absolute safety of the capital. What causes even more outrage is the authorities' response after the attacks. Instead of explaining to people how to act in times of danger, officials and security agencies focus on fighting information. Posting photos and videos of the strikes becomes a bigger irritant for the system than the strikes themselves. It seems that the main task is not to protect the population, but to maintain an image of calm on television screens. Against this backdrop, the gap between ordinary Muscovites and the upper echelons of Russian power becomes especially noticeable. While some people in the middle of the night lead their children to bathrooms away from the windows and try to figure out where to find shelter, others continue to live behind the high fences of closed residences. For ordinary residents, the attacks have become a part of everyday life. For the political elite, they still remain something distant, existing only in reports and press releases. At the same time, Moscow presents a strange contrast. In one part of the city, people read news about new strikes, check neighborhood chats, and listen closely to every unusual sound. In another part, social events, lavish presentations, and parties continue as if someone is stubbornly trying to prove that nothing is happening. But each new attack shatters this illusion more and more. Today, the main fear of Muscovites is not the drones themselves. What frightens them most is the realization that the system which for years promised absolute protection turned out to be unprepared for the test. And each time after new explosions in the capital, more and more people are asking themselves the same question. If the authorities cannot guarantee safety in the very heart of Russia, then how truthful were all the other promises made by the Kremlin? And in the Kremlin, they haven't even changed the tune. There, it seems a kind of parallel reality exists, where oil depots aren't burning, there are no fuel shortages, and drones reaching the Russian capital have no impact whatsoever. This is exactly the picture Putin painted in yet another conversation with the court propagandist Zarubin. While the whole country witnesses regular strikes on strategic targets, the president of Russia assures all means of defense are in place, the system is working, and the problems are not critical. If you translate from Kremlin speak into plain language, it goes something like this. There's not enough gasoline, but there's no shortage. Facilities are burning, but there is almost no damage. Drones are coming in, but they have no impact at all. It seems that the main task of the Russian authorities today is not to solve the problem, but to convince the population that the problem does not exist. The Kremlin is even trying to present the fuel crisis as an element of a Ukrainian information operation. Lines at gas stations are not a shortage. Disruptions in supply are not a problem. Strikes on the energy infrastructure are nothing serious. Everything is operating stably and with a large safety margin, at least according to official statements. However, the longer this performance goes on, the harder it becomes to hide the obvious. If all the defense systems are working flawlessly, then why are Moscow residents waking up to explosions? If the strikes don't matter, then why does the government react so nervously to every video of an impact? If the fuel situation is under control, then why bother publicly explaining to the population that the reserves will last only a few more days? But the most ambitious part of the performance wasn't even the stories about the economy or air defense. Putin once again started talking about major offensives, future conquests, and victories. From the Kremlin offices, everything looks extremely simple. There are only a few kilometers left to one city and even less to another. Just a little more and supposedly another line of Ukrainian defense will collapse? There is only one inconvenient detail in these statements. Most of these kinds of forecasts have been repeated by the Russian leadership for many months, and in some cases for years. The more difficulties accumulate within Russia itself, the more grandiose the promises become on television screens. While Muscovites are searching for bomb shelters, they are being told about the upcoming capture of new territories. While the regions are facing fuel shortages, they are being told that the enemy will soon be surrounded. While drones are reaching strategic targets, they are being shown a picture of absolute control. And this is precisely the main paradox of Russia today. The real country is increasingly confronted with the consequences of the war. The television country continues to live in a world of endless victories, breakthroughs, and grandiose plans. And the wider the gap grows between these two realities, the louder the Kremlin has to repeat its favorite phrase, "Everything is under control." And what do you think about the latest events? Share your opinion in the comments. Like and subscribe so you don't miss the main news. See you in the next episode.